All right, let's jump into this week's lecture. First, let me give you sort of a perspective here. Is the first couple of weeks we've covered simple, basic topics that aren't that involved legally. And we did that deliberately for legal skills because, again, we don't want this class to be an obstacle to your success, but something that actually helps you succeed. So, in that regard, we didn't want to give you too much early on while you're getting your sea legs for law school. Now we're going to start into the more substantive aspects of things with a gentle introduction to more substantive issues through outlining. Um, Outlining is one of those things that in a lot of ways, is unique to law school, but in a lot of ways not. It's just a tool used in law school to accomplish a lot of these things. To accomplish creating a good study tool. And it's been proven to be effective for as long as anybody's been doing this. So let's continue. So today we're going to discuss the purpose and the process of outlining. We'll discuss your outline format, which is just what you would imagine. It's in the format of an outline. And then we'll talk about how to create your outline and how to use your outline. We'll get more into that last issue later on when we talk about using model answers and evaluating your own writing. But this is a place where you start considering those issues. So you've heard outlining. You've heard about it maybe in property and perhaps contracts. Perhaps some of your other professors have brought it up to you and say, hey, you better start doing your outlining. Well, now's the time to do so. And it's really, in the first instance, outlines are a good tool for reviewing material you learned in class. Now, there are different ways of doing that. Of course, you can do that by reviewing your notes, but also, as a second tier tool, outlining is a great way of reviewing material that you did learn in class. More importantly, though, it helps you organize your class materials in a way that you can use it on an exam question. Now, if you have an open note exam question, that's great. If not, it still organizes your class materials in a way that you could use it on an exam question because you've used it to prep for the exam question. And finally, it's generating a document for studying, possibly for the exam if you have the open notes exam or open outline exam, as some professors do. And now's a good time to ask your professor that. Hey, what am I going to be able to use on the exam? This will be maybe a little bit different of a year. So it's worth asking that question. And just knowing that answer will put you in a better position to start shaping your study experiences to be more tailored to the experiences you will be having come exam time. And part of that is recognizing what kinds of exams you'll be having and what kinds of tools you'll be able to use on the exam. So what is an outline? It's just kind of like it sounds, frankly. But it's a hierarchical organization of materials for the class. Professor Kaufman described it as the body of law that you need to know for that particular class. And for that reason, the information included in an outline should help you understand the topic in generalities as well as specifics. And I like Professor Kaufman's formulation of what an outline is, particularly because it really is supposed to be the body of law. And I choose those words, and I think she did too, carefully, because the body of law that you're choosing, or that you're capturing with your outline, will include details and it will include general principles, but it may not include some of the nitty-gritty details. This is a little abstracted from that. Sometimes you can include those details, but really when it comes down to studying and the final steps, you can't include all of the information from a class. You can't include every fact pattern from every case. And for that reason, an outline, as I'll get back to in a little bit, should not include your case briefs. Maybe a holding for a case or a fact or two to remind you of the case, but not the it's not effective to copy and paste all of your case briefs into your outline. And understanding how you create an outline will help you understand why you don't need to include that kind of stuff in there. So, okay, you want to create a document that captures all of the law, the body of law that you need to know for the class. How do you do that? Take a moment and think about where you would normally start if you were to learn about the scope of material being covered in a class. Hopefully you are all saying, thinking, or whispering to the walls, syllabus. And it's really the best place to start. That probably matches to a greater or lesser degree your book's table of contents, but a syllabus, of course, will be different in that the syllabus will highlight the material that your professor has decided to be the most relevant stuff for your class from that casebook. So the first step, you look at the syllabus. What does the syllabus show you? Well, on a week-by-week basis, it gives you the topics that you'll be covering, the pages in the book that correspond to that, and that will allow you to go to your casebook and look conceptually at what's listed in not only the casebook, but the table of contents for that section of the casebook. That's commonly going to be the structure that you'll end up with. That structure found both in the syllabus and casebook. What you need to create an outline are your case briefs and class notes. An outline is entirely distinct from case briefs and class notes. So it's a synthesis of that material. It is not another repository for that same degree of detail. You can use, and you will use, supplemental materials in the preparation of your outline. This may arise in lots of different ways. Could be horn books or treatises. You have encountered horn books and treatises before. This is like Murray on contracts, Corbett on contracts. I was working with a colleague on a trial prep yesterday on a contract issue, and we were pulling Corbett and reading from Corbett on contracts. They're great texts to be able to get what the predominant view is, and sometimes even the minority view in a particular area. Typically, those will be someone's name on, right? Corbett on contracts, Murray on contracts. We had the good fortune here at Duquesne of having Chancellor Murray, Dr. Murray, in our department for quite a while. While I didn't have him for class, I had him for contracts review. He was a monster in the contracts area. There's still a picture of him upstairs in the faculty wing. It was often joked that when God has a problem, a question about contracts, he'd go to Murray. He's that big of a deal, and it was awesome to have him around and to just hear him speak sprightly about contracts. It made you more interested it made you think it was the most interesting topic in law when you heard Professor Murray speak on it. Another side note, I learned recently why they're called horn books. Some things were so important early on in the practice of law that they were carved into horns, which were a little more resilient than the paper available back then, but also readily transferable, or could carry it around better than a big rock onto which you carved things. So that's why they're called horn books. Um, I thought that was pretty funny. I just envision all these early attorneys walking around with pockets full of horns and all the jokes that arose from that. Anyway, um, you'll use those in creating your outline, to get back to the topic at hand, because they have definitive statements. And I might also include in that area restatements. Um, the restatements, particularly for some of your classes, are going to be of paramount importance. Civil procedure, not so much. The federal rules of civil procedure are sort of the dominant reference for civil procedure. There's certainly case law. I'm not saying there isn't, but Civ Pro kind of organizes itself through the FRCP. Most other classes will have a restatement, horn book, and treatise associated with it, or multiple ones. Now, you can also use commercial outlines and other students' outlines, and those are not just asterisked once; those are asterisks. I can't say that word. They have 3 asterisks. Better. Following them. Why? Because don't use them in place of creating your own outline. Right. It is imperative. I used various examples in orientation when I spoke, but I'll use a different one today. LeBron James, if you follow basketball, you know LeBron James is the man. He's the best player of his generation. Absolutely. I'll fight people on this. It's okay. He's incredible. But he gets better because all off season he practices. He watches tape. He actually works on his game by practicing physically. He doesn't have somebody else sum up the tape for him to watch. He watches the tape. And LeBron's an important busy man. He has to act. He has to talk about Cuyahoga Sunsets, which was an awesome scene if you've never seen it. But you have to keep in mind that the reason LeBron, besides his God-given talent, right? But the reason LeBron is good is because LeBron works constantly at improving his game. He doesn't take what other people do and try and consume it as his own work. He puts the work in himself. And for one of the sections, I referred to Mike Trout doing it, and it's true too. He takes batting practice. He watches tape. He works on his fielding game to be the best player in baseball. In the same way, to be the best law student you can be, not that any of us are the LeBron James or Mike Trout of law, right? But to be the best law student you can be, the best lawyer you can be, you can't take other people's work and use it as your own. You have to synthesize the material. And an important tool for getting to a good understanding and perhaps a good synthesis of a general area of law are commercial outlines and other students' outlines. You shouldn't just slap your name atop of it and all of a sudden it be yours and you have an outline. You didn't make an outline. And the value of an outline is twofold. One, it's in creating it. 2, it's in using it. And the first one is more important most times than the second. So you don't want to rely on those, but you use them to create or to fill in gaps in your understanding. Any number of sources you can go to is fine. Make sure they align with what you're doing in your class, but there's a lot of places to go to get information about law. That's why law libraries are so big. Well, one of the reasons. So how do you create an outline? As in class, I said, until about this point in the semester, you really don't have enough material to include to make an outline. outline is really like creating a wall, and up to this point, you just had a pile of bricks. So, how do you turn those bricks into a wall? First, you have to choose what to include and what to organize. And do not organize according to cases, rather, organize according to concepts and rules. In the intro lecture today, if you watched it, and I recognize some of you jumped straight to the chase and are on this, but without seeing that. But I get into this topic more there. What I want to emphasize to you is that unlike most educational experiences, law school commonly will, at least in class, focus on the discussion and examples of individual cases. In fact, when I had torts, my professor, Vanessa Brown Barber, who was at Duquesne, is now, I believe, in Texas, she came into the first class. That was our practice class, not LRW. And she came into our first class and just started calling on people to talk about cases, like a 1L type experience, right? And that's all we did the whole semester. At no point did she sort of take a step back and provide a conceptual framework or concepts and how the concepts were related. That was up to us, the class, to figure out based on the examples that she provided. So it's that process of organizing according to those concepts and rules and using the case examples to fall under those headings and provide support and explanation for those headings. That is the proper way of thinking about the relation between cases and outlines and legal concepts in an outline. So again, you organize according to topics and concepts and rules. You get those from the casebook table of contents and the syllabus together. Okay. I just talked through this slide, but then went forward a slide and came back a slide, which deleted everything I recorded for this slide. I've learned now. Okay. So this is something that something very much like what I created back in the day for torts. In my torts class, my torts professor, Vanessa Brown Barber, who's no longer at Duquesne, she's down in Texas, I believe, came into class on the first day, and frankly every subsequent day, and started doing cases with us, one after the other. She didn't stop in between and provide that conceptual framework of where we were within a sort of logical tree or logical structure of torts. I had no idea. I knew each individual case. I understood respondeat superior, detour frolic. If you haven't gotten to it, you'll get to it. We have all of these concepts related somehow to one another, but until I laid it out in terms of intentional torts versus negligence, and strict liability, product liability, the harm to dignitary or economic interests, and nuisance, I didn't have the right framework. I didn't have the right bins in which to put the information that I had. Only after I sort of developed this kind of structure from the table of contents and syllabus did I get a better understanding of where everything was related to one another. So I found this step to be a very valuable step. It's not one that you have to go through, certainly not one that you have to use PowerPoint to do or any other vastly superior drawing program. But for me personally, this step towards organization was an important one because it allowed me to create a structure that I could take advantage of intellectually. Of course, each of those elements, each of those entries or blocks in the earlier slide will be expanded. Here's an expansion of negligence. You may not get this until next semester, but you will learn that there's 4 elements to negligence: duty, breach, causation, and harm or damages. And each of those elements has different things that you have to take into consideration, just like intentional torts. Who's the tortfeasor? Was there transferred intent? Was there intent to begin with? What kind of intent? What kind of intentional tort are we talking about? So the same breakdowns can happen with each of those concepts. Here's just the example for negligence. And again, this just separates them out. It gave when I created this kind of stuff, it created for me separation of the concepts so that I could see how everything played in together into the overall concept for this of negligence. So once you start to develop all of these different pieces of information and organizational structures, how do you implement it as an outline? So again, as I said earlier, you organize an outline around concepts and rules. You could think of it, I think it's useful to think of it, as an inverted triangle with a concept being supported by rules, being demonstrated by fact illustrations. Each of these may need their own expansion. So, for example, battery. Well, that includes an act with intent to cause harmful, which results in harmful and offensive contact. So each of these needs their own definition. Each of these has their own examples from the cases that you read. And you can expand. Intent may be more, this is just a conceptual expansion. I have a bigger triangle inverted. Yeah, you get the idea. Some of these will require a little expansion and little explanation. Some may require a great deal more. These are phrasing from perhaps an older era of torts, but you will understand that intent can arise in different ways, regardless of what you do to what you may call it. But again, the overall framework of concept, rules, fact, illustrations stays the same. So here's an example of what I call a skeletal outline, one that's extremely stripped down. It's very similar in ways, depending on how you think, to the organizational box chart that I put up before. Instead, I've organized it as an outline. It's just like you'd imagine. So for torts, the overall Roman numeral level of organization, first one will be intentional torts. And then you'll go through the others that we highlighted before on the tort slide, and any others Professor Kravitz focuses on, or doesn't focus on, right? I mean, you have to make sure that you align with his syllabus and with his text. But this is generally what torts will look like. You'll have battery, assault, false imprisonment, IIED, which is what you call intentional infliction of emotional distress, and then defenses. You'll have all these defenses. Sometimes you'll want to cross-reference in the outline, which is fine, because some of these defenses only apply to some of the intentional torts, but you'll appreciate those details as you get into that particular area. So let's talk about the outline format. Now you've started to see how you include it and why an outline is a particularly good way of organizing it. Because of that hierarchical structure of an outline, that's what outline, as an actual table of contents style outline, because that is structured as it is, it's very easy to apply it to capturing these legal concepts. And here we'll talk here we'll talk a little more about outline format. Here's what my outline maybe would look like for some of these areas. Here's battery. There's an act, intent, and harm. And the harm has to be willful and substantial certainty that the results will occur. And in a complete outline, I would have a definition of an act, a definition of intent, definition of willful, perhaps referencing restatement third, book, case, whatever it might be. But with each granular one, for sure, you're going to have some information about cases. This isn't your case brief. That's too much information. This paragraph is too much information, but it's actually, I think, when you're in an early stage of your outline generation, good to include more detail than you need. As you refine your outline, you can remove that information more easily than going back and capturing new information to include. So you include some detail of the case, enough facts to sort of jar your memory, and the holding is always, for an outline, one of the more important things to include, because that holding by the court is the concrete piece of information that is part of the body of law that you're learning. The other thing I want to point out to you that will really do serve you well when you are making an outline. You see after 1B, 2A, and B that there's green brackets there and it says where the information was obtained. Of course, from a case is fine. The other is from an in-class hypo. The reason you want to include that information here and include it early on is that you will likely want to go back and check, if not this, some aspect of your outline, some of the details of your outline, to make sure that the facts line up with the particular hypothetical question or the particular task that you're being asked to do. So what I strongly recommend is including if it's an in-class hypo, include the week. If it's a case, include the page in the case book or anywhere else you got information about that case in here, because it will save you a ton of time when you go back during studying and you want more detail about the case to just bam, have the page number to go to in order to get that additional information. If you don't have that page number, you could spend days trying to find that information. I know that in property, I was looking at future interests, which you will delightfully get to in this semester in property for the day students, and next year for night students. And I had this explanation of a springing executory interest, which you'll learn about. And it was a very good definition, but I could not find where I got it. I could not find where I got it to save my life. And even though I felt it was right, I just needed to prove to myself that it was right. It took me weeks to find where I got it, which was one of the outline books, Gilbert's in that instance, that I pulled that definition from because I liked it particularly well. It would have made my life a lot easier if I had put on my outline, well, this comes from page 109 of Gilbert's. That'd have been awesome. So I'm telling you now, so you don't have to go through such a thing. Put those details in there. You'll appreciate your future self will like your past self more. So after you go through, as I said before, let me take a step back. Like I said before, you're going to have multiple outlines. And in fact, I found that crucial for studying because sometimes I needed to understand where I was within the big picture, not looking through a long document like your initial outline, but maybe just looking through that skeletal outline. That was very useful for me because it allowed me to sort of assess generally across the spectrum of the class things I was familiar with and things I wasn't familiar with where I could focus on. And then that let me go deeper into my outline. Typically, the way I generated that skeletal outline was starting with your big outline. And let's get back into that now. When your first outline will be very long. As you can imagine, what I've described to you will be a lot of information. You'll pull things in from your class notes, such as hypotheticals or statements of the law that your professor had phrased in a particular way. And if you, other aspects of class that allowed you to better understand the topic, you may want to throw in your outline. Remember, this is your document. You make it how you want it. But regardless of how you choose the details for implementation, this initial outline will be very long. You then use this very long outline to create different outlines. Save them as separate documents, of course. That way you keep all of the work that you generated in making your initial outline. But I went two different routes when I created those sort of refined outlines, I'll call them. The first, skeletal, would be if I were to take every bit of explanatory text out of my outline and just left the words and headings there. That I would jump back a couple slides if I was live, but I have learned that will delete what I recorded for those other slides. So instead, I will remind you back to those skeletal outlines that I had a couple slides ago. There, it just had intentional torts defenses. And that isn't necessarily something that you would use as your primary study tool, of course. It doesn't have the details you need. But it's a conceptual tool for sort of helping you learn where you are within the broader picture. Skeletal outlines are the bomb. And they should maybe be only a page or two long for each course. I then included a condensed outline. And a condensed outline was was sort of an in-between the complete outline and the skeletal outline. There, I included definitions and rules, but no cases. And that's not your best, nor should that be your only outline. But for me, when I was trying to memorize rules and memorize, things I needed for the exam, I didn't want a big document which had too much detail in it. I wanted a document that was just the rules, because that's all I wanted to do with that aspect of my studying. So I had a condensed outline that included only the rules and definitions. I still had that big outline that I'm still going to refine into a more efficient tool, but that intermediate condensed outline was of crucial importance to me. And for some classes, I think it's awesome. Evidence and con law, when you get there, are built for those kinds of condensed outlines because there's so much information there. It's easier to see it in that sort of scrunched format. So the skeletal outline, again, should contain the headings and rules, but not, the condensed outline should contain the headings and rules, but not the case holdings and examples. This will be part of your exam study. And by this, I mean that process of creating these different study tools. Because every time you develop a skeletal outline or a condensed outline, you're making decisions about what's important. And when you do that, you are actively engaging the material and are employing synthetic skills to actually consolidate and encode that material as you parse what is important to include at which tier of organization or which tier of detail. That in and of itself is one of the most valuable things regarding an outline, is its creation, like I've said before. So let's talk about creating and using your outline. And in part, this will tie into your assignment for next week. Let's talk about that assignment briefly. For all of us, all of you, both evening and day students, you have contracts. So let's start on contracts. You'll do this for each of your classes. Contracts is one that's particularly, contracts and torts. I've talked a lot about torts, but contracts just as well. You're going to have to outline, so let's do your contracts materials. The outline should reflect a logical hierarchy resembling the syllabus or the table of contents of your casebook. It should be arranged, again, around concepts and rules rather than cases. It should contain materials synthesized from all different kinds of sources, case briefs, class notes, supplements, and again with citation, because it makes your life easier. Okay? And contracts. Let's talk a little bit about what might be in that document. Again, you begin with the broad concepts. Where will you find these? He pauses expectantly. Well, you'll find these in your, I'm waiting for you to say it with me, but table of contents and syllabus. And those will be your Roman numeral tier of organization. What issues and topics did you discuss under each of these broad concepts? And here's one thing I'd like to really emphasize to you, that you want to include things that you discuss in class in your outline. As you know, I think as I've stated before and as I'll state again, the concepts that your professor emphasizes in class are a good reflection of what your professor thinks is the important aspects of your area. Accordingly, information from class can be wildly useful in focusing your study efforts. So include those in your outline. What rules are associated with those issues and topics? And then what are some fact examples of these rules? If you found, if the professor gave 3 examples of meeting of the minds, right, of mutual assent, and one particularly resonated with you, then include that one. If you really didn't get the other 2, you can hold off including them, but make sure that you understand what was trying to be communicated to you with that example. You don't want to toss the example because you get a different one better. But at the same time, you have to make sure you include all the important stuff. So, this is where you have to make the decisions that are so important to the generation of an outline. What was important in class that you discussed? What hypos were important? What perhaps analogies or examples did you find most explanatory? And again, where the fact examples come from will make a big difference. Hypotheticals from class are commonly very good sources because some professors, not all, will base exam questions off of those hypotheticals, depending on how they go in class. Okay, I'm going to go over this slide, and then in the summary video, I'll talk a little bit about how you use your outlines. Remember, this is your document. It will help you answer exam questions, and it'll help you do so correctly. But the reason those are italicized and red is that it will only work if this is your document, and it will only help you answer exam questions correctly if you have spent the time and energy creating the outline. Using someone's outline is not doesn't make any sense. Honestly, it doesn't make any sense unless you're in an absolute pickle, and nobody's in that kind of absolute pickle right now. Of course, organization and depicting hierarchy is important. That's why an outline is the tool used in law school to capture that kind of hierarchical organization. So, each week include time in your schedule to update your outlines. This will serve as an effective review of material, of your class notes, and of the course in general. So, doing it every week will serve you well. Waiting until Thanksgiving to outline all your courses will put you in a bad... I'll say it. It'll put you in a bad place. It's the equivalent of cramming. And cramming is a painful thing to try in law school. Will it work sometimes? Yeah, maybe. If it doesn't work, you feel real bad. So you don't really want to do that. Instead, start outlining now. In future years, you may start outlining as soon as the course starts because you know exactly what you're doing. First year, however, you needed to wait until you got a little bit of material under your belt, if you will, before outlining. Now you have that material, so now, not just for contracts, even though that's our assignment here, start outlining for each of your classes. And we will explore a couple ways, briefly, in which you can use your outline in the summary lecture.